When I think of the American dream, I think of exclusivity, to be quite honest with you. I think that dream, just like the foundation of America, was only held out to a few and was only meant for a few. It was meant for the most part for those who had come from Europe, who were landowners, who were part of the aristocracy, who had held to them the promise that they could indeed prosper in this country. The Constitution was not intended for people who were landless, for people who were not male, for people who were not white. This country was just simply not founded that way. We had to have amendments in order to make this democracy more and more inclusive. And so with the American dream as well, it was held out to those who were white, to those who were male, for the most part, and others had to fight for inclusion in it.
When somebody says American dream, what are the pictures that pop into the head?
The ability to be able to live as a full citizen. When I was coming of age, the dreams that were held out for me to attain were ones of self-actualization. They were not so much succeeding within the society as to succeed within one's own skin and to try to attain a sense of your own full humanity, because that was the fight in those years. You were constantly being degraded wherever you looked. There were stereotypes about you, about your culture, about your social class. And so my parents always sort of reinforced in my sisters and I that you have to set your own standards of excellence. You have to strive to become a full person. It did not reach beyond the self into, let's say, attaining success within society, because it was sort of a given. If you can just first maintain your own humanity, reify your own personal worth, you then flow into this system as an entity.
So let me ask you, can you finish this sentence? The picture I have of the American dream is, do you have a snapshot of it?
The picture I have of the American dream is one of an illusion. It's one of an illusion that's been set out for us and that we have to shape in our own image. It is indeed a dream. A dream is something that's ethereal. A dream is something that's not really quite there. And when I think of the American dream, that's what I think of, something that is manufactured, something that is ethereal, something that's not quite there.
Let's move on, if we can, to the books we want to talk about. And let's start with Nella Larsen's passing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just start at the basic level of the book. Is a Gatsby-like reinvention of self, in your mind, possible for African Americans?
I have seen it happen. There are some African Americans who are today able to quote unquote pass. And they're able to pass into greater, not so much of skin color, but to pass into the larger society, but by simply sublimating those things which are considered quote unquote too ethnic or too political. So therefore they aspire to the values of the broader society. They try very hard not to stand out as far as the way they look physically, the way they might dress, the language they might speak, the foods they might eat, the values they might hold. And they are acceptable, the Colin Powells of America. It was such a phenomenon to me that Colin Powell was so deeply loved by the American media and actually touted as becoming president. And when you looked at the man, you sort of understood what could be more American than someone who was willing to die for this country. Than a man who was a general, than a man who was that conservative, a man who was also fair-skinned, which was extremely important, and who had Republican leanings.
Why do you think Larsen starts passing with that sweltering summer heat?
Because that symbolizes the oppressiveness of the society in which the Irenes of the world lived in. Irene was a middle-class black, who was talking of sending her children to Europe. And they took summer vacations out in Martha's Vineyard and this sort of thing. And yet and still, what she was oppressed by was the color of her skin. So she had to worry about whether or not when she was taking an iced tea at the top of this very fancy hotel, whether or not she would be embarrassed and shuffled out.
Let's if I can, because one of the things I want to do is always kind of help us with the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
How does Irene escape the heat?
Irene passes. That's right. Irene, she doesn't announce that she is white, but she doesn't deny it either. So she just simply, she goes up, she's fair enough to pass as white, and she sits there and she just simply pretends. And that's what Claire brought out to her later in the book. You have when it has been convenient for you. You have indeed passed. I just did it for higher stakes.
So they're on the roof of the Drayton, kind of the Drake Hotel, and Irene kind of sees this woman looking at her.
And she's afraid that maybe there's a white woman who has recognized that she is black and that she's about to be accosted. And then you have this whole wave of emotion that flashes through her. First there's anger, then embarrassment, and then she steels herself for what she thinks is an impending confrontation. And that shows you it's quite a way to live, is it not? Irene is not able to just move as herself as a human being throughout that society. She has to always be second-guessing herself.
Two Negro women meeting at the top of being who they are. They're both pretending, I guess, on the top of that hotel.
Oh, yeah, well, definitely. Well, with Claire Kendry, her entire life has become a lie. She is living as a white woman. She has married a man who is a racist, a white man who is a racist. So every day of her life, she must live a lie. And I think as far as an artistic choice, that was an interesting one that Larson made, because she could have married a man who was a libertarian. Could have been quite possible. But she had her marry a racist, which is to show how oppressive it must be for that woman to hear these things about herself each day of her life from this man who hated black people.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a second, because I actually even want to read a little bit of what Larson wrote about John Ballou. But Claire at this moment tells Irene, we don't know as a reader yet about Ballou's racism.
No.
But in the moment we're getting to in the book, Claire says to Irene, well, that's what everyone wants, just a little more money. All things considered, it's even worth the price. Do you think that there's sort of, what's Larson trying to say here in that moment about money and passing and access?
That basically that in order to attain Claire's concept of the American dream, which is the attaining of materialism, that she is willing to make any sacrifice, to go beyond the sacrifices that are even laid out in the mandate, which are hard work and thrift. She's actually willing to sacrifice her own psyche in order to attain material things, in order to attain a certain amount of psychological freedom, because that's all she's getting is basically psychological freedom, because she came from a milieu where she could have married a black doctor or a black lawyer. Those were the people that she moved among. She could have married, Irene's husband was wealthy. He could have put her up well as far as material things, but I think Claire Kendry was after something else, and I've often wondered about that with this book. It must have been that she wanted the psychological freedom to move within American society and to be considered a human being, because even the wealthiest black was not considered the equal of the poorest white.
Sir, you don't see her as psychologically tormented?
I see her as being drawn back to her own roots, definitely, yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Because one must be what one is. At some point you want to just breathe free and to truly be yourself. It's the same thing with people who are homosexual and who are in the closet. There's a point when you just want to simply not have to guard every word, guard every gesture, but to simply be oneself. And that's what Claire Kendry gives up. So in a sense, she is in a psychological cage. But then there are other times in her life when she can be in the rooftop of fancy hotels and not have to worry, when she can go into stores. But they don't really do much. When you think about it, it's a very prescribed world that these women move in. It's a world of shopping and of tea parties and cocktail parties and of second homes. So that's why I kept saying to myself, what is it that she wanted that she couldn't have attained if she stayed in the black bourgeoisie?
And that is that freedom to be white.
I think, yeah, that freedom once you move in the outside society, yeah.
Can I ask you, we're also thinking of The Great Gatsby.
Mm-hmm.
do you see any similarity between Claire going back and Gatsby going back? I mean, here they're both characters that reinvent themselves, and what do? They go home.
They go home, yeah, because that's where you get your basic.
I mean, talk to me about Claire and Gatsby.
Your basic freedom from. Except that the Gatsby doesn't quite go home because Gatsby reinvented himself from the time he was 12 years old when he left the Midwest. You know, he had been the child of farmers, I believe, failed farmers, and he left. But he goes back to that moment in his life when he was a young Army officer, and he could have married Daisy Buchanan. You know, so he returns, I think, to her in that sense. He doesn't go all the way back. What Claire Kendry does is that she literally wants to go back into the black world of the black bourgeoisie and to just move among these people and be there. Although it's both with Gatsby and with Claire, it's their ties to their past that lead them to destruction. You know, because each of them, because of the mate of someone from their past. For example, with Claire, it's because of Irene. She begins to have the affair with Irene's husband, and that ultimately leads to her demise because Irene undermines her, and she doesn't let her know that she's met Claire's husband and that he knows now that Irene is black, so therefore Claire must be black. She doesn't let her know this, so that leads to a very explosive confrontation. With Gatsby, he has the affair with Daisy, which leads to Daisy's husband letting the other man know. It's so bizarre, leading him to believe that perhaps it was Gatsby who'd run over his wife, and that leads to Gatsby's death. But the particulars aren't important. What I think both authors are showing is that these characters being drawn back to their past ultimately leads to their destruction. If they had stayed there in the first place, perhaps that's where true happiness would have lain. So there's a sort of cautionary tale, I think, in both of those books.
How is Claire's world then undermined by Irene?
Well, what Irene does, and this is a sin of omission, she meets Claire's husband in the street just by happenstance, and Irene is walking arm in arm with another one of her friends who is obviously a black woman. She looks black. And the husband sees the two of them together. He makes the connection. Oh my God, the woman that was in my house with my wife is a black woman. And that makes him suspicious. Now Irene could have warned Claire that her husband had seen them and he might be suspicious, but she remains silent. And so what he does is that he secretly begins to follow his wife, and he finds that indeed she's hanging around with black people, and so she must be black. I think Larson actually says that there was this strange, enigmatic smile on Claire's face, this unreadable smile, you know, where I think almost where perhaps, you know, she might have, Claire Kendry could have in that moment been glad for his pain. Because look at all the pain that he had unwittingly committed upon her all of those years when she had to take those barbs. And that was perhaps just for that one sweet moment, revenge.
That's great. You know, when I read it, I thought to myself, you know, it's like the worst thing the worst thing that could have happened, and it wasn't so bad, almost, you know? So what happens now? There's this phenomenal ambiguity because Claire doesn't walk away from the novel unscathed.
She ends up dead. For some odd reason, she flips out of that window. And we are never told by Larson whether or not Irene, who was very close to her, took that moment to push her. Because Irene sees in this moment of the dissolution of Claire's marriage that Claire will be free. And she says, I cannot have her free. Because were she free, then there's the danger that she might run off with her husband. And so suddenly Claire is out the window. And we don't know how she got out that window. What does Irene, if Irene did indeed kill, what did she kill for? You know, she killed for stability. She killed for the continuance of her own material well-being. She killed for that elusive American dream.
Great.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask one last question about this book. You know, when we selected this book, a lot of people didn't know the novel. And I guess the question I have for you then is, do you think the book's then lost its relevance? Is that?
That's a good question.
I
think you have to take, it's definitely worth reading to understand a bit about the history of race relations in this country. Definitely, it's worth reading. I think that though the concept of passing into white society is more refined now, and one must make the intellectual leap to understand that passing is still possible, but it's no longer so much the color of one's skin as it is what's inside of one's head. If you're willing to whiten inside of your head, you are fine.